Hello, this is Christian Idealism. I'm going to do a somewhat different video today. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be making a direct response to dhorpatan's video regarding his assessment of why he thinks that the mind is just a property. Keep in mind that I don't normally do this, but because philosophy of mind is one of the things in this channel, I think it's best if I kind of clarify why I think his arguments don't really work and why I think he needs to study more in this topic before making such arguments. Again, I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm just trying to make the point that these type of arguments for property dualism, I think, need to be avoided, and I think that people need to study this subject more before they make the video that we're about to see here. But anyways, let's continue and start with the video.
With the release of Bernardo Casas' new book, The Idea of the World, which appropriately was released on April Fool's Day, Castro continues his campaign of trying to persuade the general public away from what should be the self-evident and common sense understanding that the mind is just a property.
Okay, so he starts off here with making the claim about how he thinks that it's self-evident that the mind is just a property. I don't think he's really thought about this topic well, just because of the fact that if we're gonna say that the mind is just a property, then the issue you run into is you're gonna deal with the hard problem of consciousness inevitably, even if you're a property dualist, because of the fact that if I guess what I'm trying to say is if the immaterial aspects of the mind are dependent upon the physical brain, that doesn't really explain why we have these quote-unquote immaterial thoughts in the first place. And again, that's just taking the property dualist perspective. So taking the property dualist perspective, that wouldn't make it intuitive. Now, I would say that it's intuitive that the mind is not material in that sort of way, but I wouldn't say that it's a property. And again, he has certain arguments for this, so we're going to get into that. But I think his first claim, needs more justification. And so my main thing here is that I think there needs to be better arguments for why it's intuitive that the mind is a property, and don't just make that claim, but actually make the argument for why it's intuitive. So that's why I just want to point that out. So anyways, let's continue with the video.
Bernardo Casas continues his attempts to try and convince people that the mind is not only an entity, but is the fundamental state or ground of reality. Apparently, the idea of the world is having phenomenal sales, according to Castro. If that is indeed the case, then it might mean more and more people are coming to accept the Castropian paradigm of the mind being an entity and also the fundamental entity of reality. This brings up the question, what intellectual case can be made beyond mere common sense that the mind is just a property? First off, what do I mean by the mind? The mind is an umbrella term that entails three attributes: consciousness, mentation, and interiority. To break that down further, I hold consciousness to simply be awareness.
Okay, so that's the first error I want to point out. He defines consciousness as awareness, but what he doesn't realize here is that when we're talking about awareness, we're talking about the knowledge of conscious experience. Again, within philosophy of mind, consciousness is defined as a mental experience that is just experience. It says nothing about knowledge whatsoever. That's why within philosophy of mind there is a distinction between awareness and consciousness. Awareness comes in addition to consciousness due to the fact that when you're aware of something, you gain the knowledge of it. And so it's kind of like awareness is like the additional quality of experience, but it's not experience itself. And so, like, for example, in our dreams, we dream every night, okay? but we're not always aware of those dreams. However, we still experience those dreams. We're still conscious of those dreams. We just don't we're not aware of those dreams. And so I think this is the fundamental problem, is he seems to be equating what I would call self-reflexive consciousness with consciousness proper, and I think that's his first error, that self-reflexive consciousness is our awareness, and it's the knowledge of conscious experience. However, conscious experience, which is consciousness proper, is just experience, and that's it. There's no knowledge involved in it. And so I think that's the first big error that he makes in this video. So I just wanted to point that out here. But anyways, let's continue on with what he has to say next.
And in higher order organisms, self-awareness as well. Mentation is mental activity which, for clarification, includes phenomena like fantasizing, thinking, deciding, hallucinating, dreams, and neurosis.
Well, again, the same criticism would apply to here as well. Is what he's talking about here is he's talking about awareness and the will. And so, like, when you make free will decisions and when you're thinking about something, that's all self-reflexive consciousness. So I guess if we're going to take his definition of mentation, that would just be self-reflexive consciousness, if I'm understanding him right. But again, with his last definition, it seemed like he was conflating consciousness proper with self-reflexive consciousness, whereas here he's just defining self-reflexive consciousness as itself. So again, that's why we need to define our terms correctly. But I guess my criticism for this would be that he needs to understand that there's a distinction between the knowledge of consciousness and consciousness itself. One final point would be that dreams are largely non-self-reflexive. So what that means is, like, again, we dream every night, but we're not always aware of those dreams. So again, he seems to inflate mentation with consciousness proper, and that's just not the right way to go. But anyways, let's continue on with what he has to say after this.
And interiority is subjectivity, or in other words, qualia. The first case I can make for why the mind is just a property is philosophical. The reasoning is that the attributes of the mind are all actions. They are attributes that have what I call subject entailment, which means these attributes or characteristics entail an entity or subject that which has it. Just like walking entails a walker, just like talking entails a talker, just like digesting entails a digester, consciousness entails that which is conscious. Thinking entails a thinker. Hallucination entails that which is hallucinating. Dreaming entails a dreamer. The qualia of pain entails an entity or person that which is experiencing the pain. Meditation entails a meditator. Pleasure entails that which is experiencing said pleasure, just like speaking entails a speaker.
Again, I can't keep on stressing this enough. He keeps on making the false conflation between consciousness proper and self-reflexive consciousness. Again, self-reflexive consciousness is awareness. If we are only talking about awareness, and if we're going to say that awareness is a byproduct of consciousness, then I would actually agree with dhorpatan here with regards to the emergence of self-reflexive consciousness. I actually take the view as an idealist that self-reflexive consciousness, or knowledge of consciousness, of conscious experience, is actually a byproduct of our brains. And I know this seems kind of odd, but I think that's the best explanation. But if we're talking about consciousness proper, I don't think that consciousness proper, or experience itself, is a byproduct of the brain. I think that the brain helps one to gain the knowledge of what it's experiencing, but it's not those experiences itself. And it certainly, again, if we're dealing with the hard problem of consciousness, there's no way you can actually explain subjective experience with neurological processes in the brain. Now, you could explain awareness or the knowledge of conscious experience, but you can't explain experience itself through neurons in the brain. And that's what the hard problem is like, the hard problem isn't about awareness, It's not about our knowledge of conscious experience. What it is it's about consciousness itself, or consciousness proper itself. And so I think the problem with dhorpatan here is that he again seems to conflate self-reflexive consciousness with consciousness proper. And again, if we are only talking about self-reflexive consciousness, then I would actually agree with dhorpatan that is a byproduct of the brain. But if we're talking about consciousness proper, then I don't think it is. And so I think once you understand this distinction, then these criticisms and these supposed evidences for property dualism can be addressed. And so now I'm going to go what he has to say next after this.
The second case I can make for why the mind is just a property is again philosophical. In order for a phenomenon to not be a property, it must be an entity, and an entity is that which has independent existence. For a phenomenon to have independent existence, it must exist spatially. This is because independent existence in reality in and of itself requires a specified location, whether at a point or a field, that thereby existentially verifies and entails separateness and distinction from some other given phenomenon. To be an entity also necessitates a boundary to delineate its nature from some other entity and its nature. And having a boundary entails having a spatial location where that boundary begins and ends. The mind does not exist spatially on its own, since it is immaterial. The mind does not have a boundary, since it is incorporeal. Therefore, the mind is not an entity. It is just a property.
You know, if dhorpatan would just read idealist philosophers like Bernardo Casas, the one he's criticizing here, he would actually understand that we don't disagree on very much. So what Bernardo Casas argues in his book is that each of us are universal, or what he says is each human being is a disassociated aspect of universal consciousness, and that we are like the alters of universal consciousness. And what he also says is that alters do have a boundary. So just because alters have a boundary, that doesn't mean that it's a property. And so that's kind of the problem with dhorpatan here, is he hasn't really studied the subject much, and so he's making arguments that have already been addressed in the literature. Now again, I'm not trying to be mean here, but if he's going to make videos on these topics, just at least read the books that you're criticizing before you actually criticize the book that you're criticizing. And so my basic response to this would be that no, it's false, that minds don't have to be spatially located. It's not ontological. It can be logical. They can be logically located within universal consciousness, but they don't have to be ontologically located within universal consciousness. So while it is true that there is a distinction between each alter within universal consciousness, that doesn't mean that therefore it can't have a boundary, because it still would have a boundary, because that's what we experience. Our minds can, we can think thoughts, but that's within ourselves. With outside of our own minds, there is a boundary that exists. One final major criticism I want to point out here is that notice that his first argument was that consciousness requires a subject. But then his second argument was that consciousness doesn't need an entity. But isn't a subject and an entity, aren't they the same thing? I mean, it would seem like, at least it would seem intuitive that a subject literally is an entity, because that's what awareness is. And so if his first argument works, then his second argument doesn't. But then if his second argument works, then his first argument doesn't. And so it seems like the best explanation is that a subject simply is an entity, that they're one and the same. And so that would be kind of my other big issue with his arguments. But anyways, let's finish off what he has to say for the rest of the video.
The third case is empirical, or rather based on observational evidence, as we always have it confirmed and never disconfirmed that a mind is always attached to or a characteristic of an organism or living being. So right off the bat, we can see that Bernardo Casas' paradigm and all these books he has written are for an erroneous notion and a deeply flawed philosophy that can't even get off the ground. Since not only is the mind not metaphysically fundamental, it is not even an entity. Thanks for watching.
Okay, so let me address the first point before I actually address what he had to say at the end. So, first of all, saying that minds are dependent upon a body, that's just an explanatory model. That's not an empirical fact. So the fact that he thinks that this is an empirical fact, but again, that's just an explanatory model, because under idealism, idealists do not deny that the mind and the brain are the same ontological substance, because they are the same ontological substance. They're both mental in nature. And so just because a mind is still in the brain, that doesn't mean that therefore physicalism or property dualism is true. What it means is that the brain is the extrinsic appearance of the mind, because that's the explanation under idealism. And so the fact that he thinks that this quote-unquote empirical fact disproves idealism, I think, again, shows that he hasn't studied this topic very well. And then with regards to his last comments with Bernardo Casas, again, if you're not going to even read the books that you're criticizing here, please do not make a video trying to refute Bernardo Casas if you're not even going to read the arguments that he makes in his books. I haven't read all of his books. I've read one of his books, but I can clearly understand his philosophy way better than dhorpatan can, because I've actually read his material. I mean, yeah, I haven't read all of his material, but I've certainly read his material and I understand his material. But it seems like dhorpatan here doesn't understand any of it because he hasn't read any of it. And so my point here, dhorpatan, if you're watching this, I'm not trying to be mean. I'm trying to make the point that if you're going to criticize a philosopher of mind, which in this case is Bernardo Casas, please read his books first and try to understand his view before you actually make a video on it. Because as we've seen here, if you're going to criticize someone but then not read his books, then your arguments are probably not going to work, or your arguments were addressed in the book itself. And so that's why it's always smart to actually read your opponent's arguments and understand your opponent's arguments the best you can before you make objections to them. And so and that goes for any subject, not just philosophy of mind, but any subject. So anyways, I want to thank you guys for watching. Again, I'm not trying to be mean here. I'm just trying to make the point, and I hope you understand dhorpatan. I'm not trying to be mean to you or anything like that. I respect you. We can have our disagreements. That's fine. But yeah. Anyways, thank you guys for watching, and have a nice day.